Now, we're ready for our next panel session. And I know the last one had quite a bit of activity on that. This panel session is called Emerging Markets in Asia, the Ones to Watch and Why. Now, the moderator for this panel session is going to be John Hibbard. John, if you would please come up. The panelists include Chen Zhang, who's the MD of TE Subcom USA, Mr. Sam Johnson, who's a director at Equinix, and Dominic Arey, who's the founder of AEC Advisory. If you all would please come up, we'd appreciate it. John, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, audience, for the opportunity to come back and be involved with yet another panel. And this one's has some real excitement in the sense that we're going to be looking forward. The other one we talked about was some of the issues that people had faced in the past. Now we're going to look forward and see where are the opportunities that lie in the Asian region and then more in the global region. Obviously, there's countries around here that are, and we're based in Thailand at the moment, but in this general proximity that are growing at a rapid rate. We've heard stories already about Indonesia and Cambodia. They're growing at a rapid rate. We talked about other countries. Let me put it to my first panelist, and I will choose Chen because he's closest to me.
Thank you, John.
What are the markets that you think that over the coming decade, let's say, are the ones we should really watch the next 5 years, maybe? What are the ones that we really should be watching, and for you think present some interesting opportunities?
Thanks, John. I think from my perspective, which is the perspective of a subsea supplier, I think we first look at the market in terms of what's driving the market. I think it's important to understand that in this particular emerging market, most of the countries are somewhat developing the infrastructure one way or another, but really the driver that we see in the current days and age are really twofold. One is the increasing bandwidth capacity requirement. Second is the increasing competition. I think from the previous panel, we have heard some of the specific examples. So coming back to John's question, in the next couple of years, the next few years, if you will, the areas that we see the most growth potential, again, relating to what that's coming from, is where the key drivers, that is the ISPs, the data centers, the cloud, and the content providers. Where they are going is where the emerging market needs could be most significant. So I think going down the Asian different countries, certainly see some of the Southeast Asian countries as the potential hub for traffic growth. The previous panel and the speaker talked about Indonesia. We certainly see that as one of the areas that the connectivity is sorely needed, and projects like government projects like Palapa Rings to interconnect different islands is certainly an area of growth for the next few years. And this, we see the continuing expansion of subsea networks in these areas. Some of the other countries, I think, where data center or new international gateway is well suited is another area to me that potentially can bring some of the future growth opportunities. Thailand being one example. I think a number of companies in Thailand, some of those in the audience, they probably know better than I do, is numerous international systems coming in with the Gulf of Thailand, whether the connectivity from the east or the west, essentially form a new gateway through the terrestrial crossing. And this serves a huge redundancy, a resilience of the network, a redundancy role, which to us, another potential driver for the network. because the huge bandwidth expansion, carriers are no longer satisfied with one single route. They're looking for redundancy to protect their network in the case of natural disasters. And I think Thailand being one case of example where we see a number of systems are likely to take place. It's strategically positioned to address the redundancy needs. One other area I think we've already talked about by the other panels as well is North Asia, be it Japan to U.S. or China to U.S. We have a number of cables announced. Fabrizio's Global Cloud Exchange is coming along, and potentially it could be a couple other cables interconnect. And again, we see the huge bandwidth requirement to U.S. Part of it is driven by content. Part of it is driven by the data or cloud traffic, and alternative participants of this market, non-traditional telcos coming in, and they're really the game changer for the capacity. Going back to what I mentioned, is the capacity driver is really for the growth of the network.
Thank you, Chen. That's good. You talked not only about geography, but about types of traffic and types of markets that might be growing. Maybe I'll move to the other end and speak to Dominic. Dominic, you're from AEC Advisory. You're based here in Thailand. Can you give us, in 1 minute, an outline of who AEC Advisory is? Because it's a name that I'm not familiar with, and I imagine that there's quite a number in the audience that are not familiar also. And then that'll lead me right into asking you some hard questions.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks very much. So very briefly, AEC Advisory is a corporate advisory firm, so consulting firm, as well as we advising our clients on acquisitions, mergers, investment feasibility. We typically specialise in the telecom and media sectors, and we deal with telecom operators, regulators, investors who are looking at building new networks, making acquisitions, restructuring their business, etc. My background is in telecoms and consulting, and I was the managing director of British Telecoms consulting business previously for Asia, as well as for Value Partners, which is a ex-McKinsey spin-off. So we are really what you call a consulting firm. We've had the privilege of working with a number of clients across emerging Asia in the last couple of years, so including Myanmar, which is one area which I think I'll talk about depending on your question. But
well, that was going to be my question. I was going to say, where are the jewels that you know, as a man looking at it from a financial point of view, you're obviously looking at where you can make a dollar. So where are the jewels that are going to emerge?
Well, as I said, I think the last 2.5 years, I've had the privilege of being involved with two clients in particular who have been investing into Myanmar in the telecom sector. One of them was bidding for one of the telecom licenses, and the other was successfully now the partner of the incumbent MPT. They've entered into a joint operations contract for 10 years. That's Sumitomo, KDDI, and MPT. So from my perspective, when I look at one of the last frontier markets in Southeast Asia or in Asia as a whole, in terms of a market with scale to drive traffic, from a telecom perspective, from a cable system perspective, Myanmar is that market because it has a population that is large enough. It's a population of 50-odd million people. Until a few weeks ago, we thought it was 62 million, but they just did a census and they realised it was only 52. But still, significant scale. It has very, very nascent telecommunications infrastructure. 3 telecom operators are only operating right now in the country. Telenor just launched, Ooredoo just launched, and MPT has a network as they've been the incumbent, but teledensity is still only 11-12% in the market today, and they're expecting it to get to 75% within the next 3 years. So 75% of the market will have access to telecommunication services they just didn't have, even a year ago.
To what extent will the opportunities for these carriers be constrained by lack of international connectivity? Is it terrestrial to Thailand is obviously one of the routes that is there, but submarine connectivity, we're here at State of Subsea, so we're obviously interested in that angle. So can you give us a view to seeing how you will service that demand for international connectivity?
No, absolutely. I mean, right now, Myanmar has definitely a lack of direct cable system access. It has great potential from the Andaman Sea on its west coast to have connectivity through to a number of cable systems. But today, if I'm not wrong, it only has a single cable system that is connecting into Yangon. So there are a couple of Thai operators who have built and are building more, overland connectivity. But even last year, when we were doing some work over there for the Ministry of ICT in Myanmar, there was an outage, and we didn't have internet connectivity, for a couple of days, and there was no redundancy available, and MPT wasn't able to restore the service very quickly. So it's definitely going to constrain development, I think. But there are a lot of other factors, as other panellists have talked about previously, in terms of rolling out infrastructure locally in Myanmar that also, similar to Indonesia, will constrain development of infrastructure.
So we're lucky today also to have Sam Johnson on the panel. Sam actually operates out of Europe, but by virtue of Jim Poole being unavailable, has generously given his time to come down and help us out with this panel. And so it's great to get another perspective of not just Asia, but looking at the emerging markets that you might be addressing in your more global perspective, Sam. And so could you tell us where you see some of the better opportunities, particularly given, you're with Equinix. Equinix is a name that we all know around here. It's always the place where we go for our data centres and put our POPs. So can you just give us a view of where you see the markets, the emerging markets that you might present opportunities to Equinix?
Yeah, well, we've done quite a bit of expansion recently, including in Asia, but also in Europe and elsewhere, both in existing metros. So I believe the Melbourne data centre, which is in the process of being built and will open shortly, is our 101st data centre. We've also opened up recently in Osaka. These locations often end up being where the subsea cables will ultimately terminate or backhaul to. We've got expansions going on in places like Singapore, also in Hong Kong. Areas like we both build new facilities, we'll partner, and we'll acquire. We recently acquired Asiatome, which bought us facilities in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai. Another area that's probably interesting for us is places like Beijing, Korea, so Seoul, India, Chennai, Mumbai. In Europe, we'll look at places like Prague, Stockholm, Madrid, Dublin. Also Riyadh, Moscow, down into Johannesburg and so on, down that way. We recently acquired a company called ALOG in Brazil, which got us into Rio and Sao Paulo. And we've got a couple of other places that we're looking at, like metros in established markets like Calgary and Houston.
And of the markets that you're going, which ones do you think are the jewels, the ones that are most devoid of what you can provide?
Well, I think that we're obviously having a very close eye on what's going on in Africa, but with locations in Brazil, and especially with all of the cable activity, and also in Dubai, that gets us access to a lot of the west coast as well as north and east Africa through these cables, and then up into Europe as well. So that's certainly an area of interest for us. India is another area of interest. I mean, the reason why we deploy new facilities is the two of the main reasons are to be within proximity of the end users. So we carry a lot of the content delivery networks and so on, but also for regulations. A lot of times countries want to keep the data in country, and customers want to keep data in country as well. So deploying in a market opens up a new market to us.
That's really interesting that you raised some of the countries that we've already talked about today, with Brazil and the South Asia cable and the cable of the Americas, and the growth that we see in cables into Brazil. So that's very relevant, and you may actually provide the opportunity for sourcing some traffic with some of these, with ARTO, for instance.
Well, I noticed that one of them goes into Miami as well, which is where we've got a great location as well.
He'll be talking you into going to Luanda shortly. and of course India, where we talked about with Fabrizio, and of course the Indian heritage of global cloud exchange, the opportunity there to, whilst they may in some ways be competitors, there's always space for another data centre, and you need connectivity, and you often have to, in this wholesale business, buy from your competitors. So that's very much part of the market.
Well, one of the things is that we've been talking about metro versus long haul, and in the presentations I did earlier in the day, we looked at the impact of CDNs, which currently drive like a third of IP traffic, growing to more than half by 2018, and the factor between metro and long haul going from 2 to 2.6 in the same period. So a lot of that data is actually staying in metro and being served in metro, but still obviously needs backhaul to origin servers and so on. But there's some quite interesting trends that are taking place quite quickly at the moment.
And if we were moving slightly eastward from here and past India into the Middle East, Dominic, you're doing any business in the Middle East, and if so, is it still an opportunity, or has it been already well built out, and we're starting to see it losing quite some of the appeal that it had a little while ago?
Yeah, we have made a specific focus on Southeast Asia for the exact reason that we have done previous work in the Middle East, but it went through a huge growth spurt, over the past decade. And I think from a telecom perspective, infrastructure perspective, we have focused on Southeast Asia now because we see a lot of, relatively greater opportunities for us in this part of the world. Particularly, as I said, with countries like Indonesia with so much scale that's been talked about a lot, but Myanmar for us we see as a huge opportunity because it's a market starting from nothing, and we don't get those opportunities anywhere. In the Middle East we don't really have those opportunities today, so I think we have still great opportunity in Southeast Asia and Indochina region.
And Chen, we see lots of cables going in on the east side of India, headed towards Europe, heading towards the Gulf. Mm-hmm. What's your perception of that being an opportunity, or have they got more than enough now and it's better to focus elsewhere?
Well, I think there's always the different needs from different customer sets, right? So multiple cable systems do exist. As I mentioned earlier, the traditional telco have the ownership of the cable, but the center of gravity seems to be shifting. Content providers coming in, Supertex, and some of those are private-owned networks are emerging. So the redundancy of the routes becomes more relevant. So I do see the needs of new systems coming in, perhaps at different pace. It's hard to say any given area where it's overbuilt. I think it's always the new routes, the different players, the different owners, and they bring the competitive environment. And ultimately, it's competitive enough to bring down the cost of the traffic, as some of the speakers said earlier, whether it be a traditional telco, content provider, or entrepreneurial systems. And we see that happen a lot.
One of the markets that we see, we hear a lot about, and it's been talked about, is market, for instance, in Vietnam. Vietnam has a limited number of cables. Some of them have been having a lot of problems of recent times, and hence we hear various stories about the internet being severely interrupted there. I know that Paul Badge-Horgan, who we talked about, and with his cable from Cambodia down to Malaysia, has aspirations that represents an alternative route for the Vietnamese to get out and get some diversity. From your point of view, how do you see the submarine cable market in with regard to, say, Vietnam?
It's certainly a market with huge potential. As a company, we've been working with a number of customers in Vietnam. Certainly, we see some degree of difficulties getting access to the international network. Vietnam, in and of itself, perhaps is a little difficult to build international. There are some of the projects being kicked around for several years, but it is a very long process. And I see, for example, in recent years, a number of Vietnamese carriers have joined a number of international gateway cable systems. So that does offer them the opportunity to interconnect to, for example, to Japan or potentially to Hong Kong and so on. But I think the need is there. The needs for diversity is there, especially for the recent press on a number of systems, the outage. So that really drives, I think, what I see as the resilience of the network, the redundancy of the network. So we certainly look forward to these opportunities and working with carriers.
And Sam, I know you're coming from the other side of the world, so it's probably hard to ask you questions about specific places, but your perception of the Vietnam, the Cambodian, the Laos, and this regional market here as a source of data centres and demand. Do you think the data centres will tend to focus mainly in the bigger locations like Singapore, KL, or do you see these other countries, particularly for the concerns about keeping their data on shore, we will see much more growth, disproportionately more growth in the emerging markets for data centres, or do you think you'll see the traditional ones just get bigger and bigger?
I think there'll be a combination. I think that you'll find that certainly the hubs, Singapore and Sydney, are both big cloud hubs for us in region. Hong Kong and Tokyo are big financial hubs in region. They will certainly continue to grow. A smaller market, there are a number of countries who are making laws about keeping data in country. And in doing so, they potentially exclude themselves from services which are in demand, like Facebook and Google and Microsoft and so on. The thing that we do have a fairly rigorous process when we go into a new market like Jakarta. One of the things that we consider is, can we serve these markets from another location? And typically, to serve them from Singapore, for example, gives you certainly adequate performance, that close, actually very good performance for most of those applications. At the other end, you've got things like high-frequency trading, which obviously have to be in the same building, but for the most part, for web applications, even interactive web applications like Facebook and so on, it's more than adequate. So then it really is a question of regulations. Regulations can both drive you into a market and drive you away from a market.
And Dominic, your home market, or where you're based anyway in Thailand, how do you see that? I mean, it's had some challenges from a telecommunications point of view with all of the different regulatory phases that it's gone through. How do you see that emerging, and particularly in regard to reliability and getting adequate submarine cable content? We saw the map that Paul Blanche-Horgan put up that's got the new cable into Thailand, and there's talk of other cables into Thailand. But what's your read of the Thai situation and its potential, and is it being held back at all by lack of submarine cable capacity?
I think the telecom industry in Thailand right now is going through a very interesting phase. It's something we've been anticipating for the last 10 years because the legacy regime of concession structures, etc., are ending or have ended in certain cases, and we're moving to a licensing regime. We're also going through a period of restructuring of the state-owned telcos who have their own international gateways. One of them being not TOT but Cat Telecom has the largest bandwidth share and runs the domestic exchange as well as the international gateway. And being a consumer of broadband, at my house in Thailand, in Bangkok, the international connectivity is the limiting factor on the user experience for broadband in Thailand. And I think, definitely there is greater opportunity for more capacity on the international gateways. I know TOT have just received some approval recently to invest in a cable system to increase their gateway capacity for international, because what we tend to have here is very high contention ratios on the international. Because landing costs, IP transit costs in Thailand are very high relative to other places such as Singapore or Hong Kong or KL even. So you tend to get throttled a lot. So I think there's definite opportunity for more capacity into Thailand. And I think that with broadband penetration still very low at around 25% in terms of household, and mobile 4G just being launched this year from True and also from DTAC in a smaller way, I definitely believe that mobile is going to be the big driver of data. And if we don't get additional capacity on the international gateways, that we are going to run into a problem, I believe, pretty soon.
I think another point is that bandwidth availability begets bandwidth consumption, which was something I discussed earlier today. If you make the bandwidth available, there's a very strong correlation between the quality of video consumption, and video is a large part of what's being driven here. You'll result in more minutes and therefore more consumption. So I think that as more capacity comes online, it'll be naturally soaked up, certainly by a lot of the consumer applications anyway.
I'd like you to tell that to some bankers that build and they will come is a good methodology, because they're certainly not in favour of that at the moment. Obviously, we heard a lot about Indonesia and all the islands that they've got, and therefore the need to have submarine cables, and they've got a lot of domestic submarine cables, and the need for a lot more. The Palapa ring is being constantly expanded, but the whole issue of submarine cables in Indonesia is somewhat clouded by all of this cabotage issue that is around, where they're making regulations that are making it more difficult to either provide cables or to repair cables. Right. What's your latest on this cabotage issue, and to what extent do you think it is just a phase that will go away and not handicap them going forward, or will it be a really significant impediment for the longer term?
I think it's a well-known issue that takes a number of years to evolve. People have been talking about the cabotage law for quite a number of years. I think at this point, from the supplier point of view, we need to have a solution to work on this particular issue. It is an impediment to construction or repair. It takes longer time to get the waivers and so on. But I certainly think that working with the local authorities and as well as some of the local partners is the right way to address this issue. From our perspective, having a local partnership who knows the law, who is familiar with how to get the waivers and so on, is tremendously helpful. And I think, at least in the near term, we're following the situation. We'll develop a contingency to address that.
So you don't really think that it's going to be a major frustration? It's a bit of, or a major impediment. It's a bit of a frustration, but you think it will ease over time?
I think so. I think the trend is for openness. Clearly understand the reason for this kind of a requirement, but I think working with locals, I think be able to find the right solution to address construction and maintenance.
I suppose it's an ill wind that blows no one any good. Andy's there building terrestrial links around the country, and so while the cabotage rules are there, he's got a little bit of an edge up.
Right, he certainly has the better knowledge than some of us who are a little remote from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's been a most useful discussion. Interesting to hear what the markets are doing and the opportunities that present themselves. So thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciated the opportunity for this panel.
Thanks to all of you. We really appreciate your time and some really good insight there. Any questions from the audience for the panel?